Indiana, we are simply passing through history. This is history.
Welcome to the Young Indy Chroniclers, a podcast about the making of the show The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, which first aired on ABC in 1992.
Kept thinking about what was Indiana Jones like as a young man. I came up with this idea of him seeing the world through the eyes of a soldier and a secret agent.
Over the course of our podcast, we're going to talk to a whole host of very talented people who either worked on this show or were there from the beginning.
We were able to shoot it on location in the real places where these events took place.
Oh, make it up as you go. Oh boy, that's great advice.
We hired some of the best European directors, a whole host of very, very talented people.
I'm your host, Peter Holmstrom.
And I'm Daniel Noah, and this is the Young Indy Chroniclers.
There's only one rule, Indiana. Stay alive.
Welcome back to the Young Indy Chroniclers, the one and only podcast devoted specifically to the Young Indiana Jones television series and franchise. I'm your host, Peter Holmstrom, and joining me on this adventure of a lifetime is Mr. Daniel Noah.
I was going to make a sort of Al Pacino joke, but I decided not to do it. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Daniel. When electing to tackle a film or television project set in history, it's not enough to merely have a good script or proper actors. You have to believe in your heart of hearts that the film is in the time period that it is set to be in. This job falls often to the production designer.
On today's episode, we are thrilled to have production designer Gavin Bocquet here.
He worked on nearly all the episodes of Young Indiana Jones and bringing not just the early 1900s to life, but also the different cultures of the 1900s. He was nominated for 3 Emmy Awards for his work. In addition, he also worked on all 3 of the Star Wars prequel films, doing some of the best work I've seen in the Star Wars franchise.
And most recently worked on the Apple TV show Silo. Gavin Bocquet, thank you so much for being here.
More than welcome, more than welcome.
Gavin, I think maybe Peter sort of touched on it, but for the audience that may not be as well-versed in sort of filmmaking language as we are, could you maybe just briefly explain to them what a production designer does and what that role is?
Yeah, I mean, in simple terms, a production designer's job physically is to create everything you see around the actors, really, whether it's foreground, background, midground, in whatever style or period the show is demanding. And in doing that, you're trying to basically push the story along and help define the characters in whatever way you can, whether it's in what they have, what they own, where they live, what they do. And generally, obviously with the help of other departments, but the look generally comes through myself or my position with the director, and maybe these days, maybe with a showrunner as well. You know, whereas you go back 10, 20 years, it was primarily the director, whereas interestingly on Young Indy, obviously George Lucas had a big input as well. And I suppose these days he would probably have been called a showrunner on that show, rather than not just the producer, but rather than the producer. So, I mean, the main aim is to really help push the story along and help define the characters. That's the main aim in however we decide to do that, whether it's building sets, whether it's finding locations, whether it's a mix of sets and locations. Visual effects, obviously, a big input. And, visual effects and Young Indy was quite an interesting story in those early days in the early sort of 90s.
Go ahead, Peter. I think you're going to say what I meant.
No. Please, go for it.
I was just going to say, before we get into Young Indy, could you maybe let us know a little bit about how you started your career and how you got to Young Indy?
That was what I was going to say. There you go.
I knew it was. I said.
I think that's a separate episode. I always think there's a charity book out there somewhere of how I got into the film business. Not for me, I mean, just how people did, because maybe not so much these days, but go back to the 80s, there was no, certainly in the UK, probably different in the US, but there was no real film school or film media school so much. There were a lot of design and art and design and theatre schools. There was a couple of post-grad film courses at the National Film School here. But certainly for me, without going back too far, it was never an option at school. It was never anything that was put in front of you. And so I went to art school. I did product design as a first degree. And then I went to the Royal College of Art and did three-dimensional design. And, in a sense, that's what I was going to be, or that was the process. And in my last week at the Royal College, that was a 3-year course still, Stuart Craig, who's obviously one of our most esteemed production designers, Harry Potter, numerous Oscars, he had been at the Royal College 10 years before, and he was just starting to design his first feature film, which was Saturn III.
In an isolated sector of our solar system, suspended in orbit around the 6th planet from our sun, lies a distant outpost, a technologically perfect world where mistakes are impossible, because the impossible is unthinkable. It is called Saturn III.
Infamous science fiction film with Kirk Douglas and Farrah Fawcett Majors.
Now take that off very slow. No, go on. Now I'm going to think about nothing but hydroponics.
And he put a handwritten note on our notice board at the college saying, basically, anybody wanting to design props for a science fiction film. Okay, well, that was, and I didn't know what it was. Was it painting flats? Was it whatever? I had no idea. So it was more a question of going to see Stuart and see what the job was. I mean, looking back, sliding doors moments, I sort of wish I'd kept that piece of paper, just as a bit of sort of history. So I went to see Stuart. Stuart was very, very sort of forward thinking at that point, late 70s, early. I mean, he came into the business in early 70s, very traditional, very much who you know, how you get in, not nepotism in a bad way, but just that sort of connection. But he was really keen, and everything was done within the art department. It was all very, whether it was graphics, everything was done with the set designers. It wasn't taken out, and Stuart could see that there were such a lot of good contractors outside who do specialist things, and Star Wars had come out obviously by then, and Aliens was being made at the same studio as we were doing Saturn III, and I think Stuart just felt that he could do with somebody with a product design background, three-dimensional, doing hand props and control panels. So it was sort of the early days of concept work, because concept people didn't really exist. They had illustrators as such, and there was a Ralph McQuarrie, and there's the odd person who would evolve like that, and Harry Lang. But there wasn't anything like there is now, the whole group out there. And I went on to Saturn III as a space equipment deviser. That was my official title, because the unions were very strong back then over here. They are still with you over there. And you couldn't get a job unless you couldn't get a union ticket unless you had a job, and you couldn't get a job unless you had a union ticket. But they didn't have any space equipment devices on the union books. So I was able to get that job basically, and I then did the next 3 films with Stuart: Elephant Man, and A History of the World with Mel Brooks.
Oh wow!
Oh, fellow members of the Roman Senate, hear me. Shall we continue to build palace after palace for the rich, or shall we aspire to a more noble purpose and build decent housing for the poor? How does the Senate vote? Fuck the poor!
Not in a sci-fi way, just going into the art department. He said that's the best way to do it, Stuart said. And he and Norman Reynolds, who you obviously know from Star Wars, the two of them were my sort of mentors, really. But, it's like a lot of people, there's a bit of synchronicity, a bit of luck, and a bit of sliding doors moments. And, if I hadn't seen that note, I probably would have had just a happy life doing something else. But
we all have that moment. We all have that moment.
Yeah,
I mean,
and it continues as well, and I mean, we'll probably come to it. But the way I got Young Indy, again, it's another bit of sort of sliding doors moment. So I think it's a little different nowadays. I would say 90% of the people that come to see us for jobs have done some sort of media or TV or film course. It's not obligatory at all, but whereas back then people came from everywhere, to do that. And And Stuart told me when I first came in, because I'd obviously got a Master of Design from the Royal College of Art as a postgraduate student, and he said, "Well, never mention that again." It was sort of, because really in the film business they weren't really interested in qualifications. It was really how you are and your work. It's a very personal, interactive, collaborative business, and just how you come across and how you interact with people is often as important as any of the work that you do.
Now, I didn't mention this in my intro, but you entered pretty quickly into the Lucasfilm sphere by the look of it. 83, you were a set draftsman on Return of the Jedi, then you're working on Return to Oz, which Lucas produced soon after. Was that, do you think that your work on Saturn III largely kind of influenced that, or was that more just like you were available?
No, it was very much as I'd been with Stuart, for 3 films. Then he was going off to do Gandhi in India, and I was too junior to really be taken. So he suggested me to Norman Reynolds, who was just starting Jedi. And as Stuart said, very clever, he said, "Look, come and do these other films, these period films." As a junior, Munchkin, like Elephant Man and the Mel Brooks show. But then people will still want you to do the more sci-fi stuff if you're interested. So you can see that connection. He put me across to Norman. I went on it. I think it's funny, there was a miscredit in there. You mentioned it doesn't matter, but I remember on one credit I was down as the set decorator or set dresser. Mike Ford was the decorator on the film. So I did very quickly ring Mike. So, "Hey, Mike, I didn't put that credit out." I can't remember. I think I was either draftsman or junior draftsman or assistant art director. I can't remember what the clarification was, but it was sort of a prop makey designery thing again, as concept artists would be doing now. They didn't really had a couple of Mike Blue, had a couple of illustrators, Dennis Rich, and Ralph McQuarrie. But there was not the great number of concept artists you see on shows these days. And that's not a criticism. That's just how things evolve into different spheres. And then I worked with Norman for 5 films and Stuart for 5. In amongst other people, so luckily they were the 2 mentors really, and the Star Wars and George Lucas connection. But I don't think. I think we'll come back at that when I got Young Indy. I don't think George remembered me. I don't think we'll have him.
Now, I'm sorry to keep harping on this, but I find it fascinating, just because this is kind of a field that is often, I'm trying to the aspiring screenwriter track. Daniel's in marketing, also is on the kind of aiming to be a producer one day. So it's like this is a world I think both of us are a little less familiar with. But like when looking at something like Return of the Jedi, let's say, or Return to Oz, or I also see you worked on Supergirl. I personally like that movie.
Yes.
Oh, she works out, huh?
Why are you doing this?
It's just the way we are.
Daniel's rolling his eyes right now. But no, I'm kidding.
Not as a production designer, obviously, but slowly going up whatever that ladder is, getting a little bit more responsible each time.
The question there being like, we see a lot of like the big design work being done, the Ralph McQuarries, the Joe Johnsons that are like the big set pieces. But for you, I believe you were still based in the UK, so you were probably more of like an on-set kind of draftsman in that way. Like, I guess more like what was kind of the day-to-day of your job like at that time?
I worked very closely with Fred Hole, who was one of Norman's art directors, sadly not with us anymore, and he was a great sort of supporter of me. And he would be doing a lot of the technical dressing, as you would call it. Mike Ford was a set decorator, but in terms of anything, I think if you specifically remember the torture chamber, the droid torture chamber in Jedi.
Sure.
There were just a lot of things going on there with stretching, and that really fell down to sort of Fred and myself. Whereas I say today, you would probably have 2 or 3 concept artists in a room working that stuff out. So what was interesting is we didn't we didn't necessarily show a lot of that stuff to George, particularly, or the director at the time, Richard. It was, we just did it. We produced something. We didn't give them hundreds of options. We gave them like a couple of options, and they sort of trusted you to go with it. Whereas now, as you probably know, producers, everybody, they want to see everything in triplicate and quadruplet, and they want to see everything before you've almost made the film before you've shot it. In that, so it's very much like just working each day to day. Sometimes in the prop room. Obviously, John Barry, the original designer, had created, and the art department had created this idea of using junk, in the Greeblies world, bringing stuff out. So all that stuff was still there, getting more, and you'd just go and sculpt things from whatever you could find. And I think one of my first jobs was dressing the speeder bikes. So they were there physically as a piece finished, but without any hand controls or anything, buttons and things. So it was a question of creating those. And the front nose cone of the speeder bike is a curtain finial from the hardware shop in Borehamwood High Street. So you were wandering down the high street looking in hardware stores for stuff. And so if you look at the speeder bike now, you'll see this little brass finial on the front. And, I've seen that put up in exhibitions, a speeder bike, looking at it, and you're going, oh, it's interesting. There's a curtain finial at the front of it. But I think George and Roger Christian and John Barry were the instigators of that world. And I think it came from a financial origin, really, because they didn't have a lot of money to do very sophisticated design from scratch and build from scratch. But of course, it gave it a brilliant look, a brilliant sort of just textural look. So obviously, we carried that on. Norman Reynolds carried that on with Mike Ford and us in the art department. So we were messing around, playing, making things.
That's fantastic. Well, you've kind of hinted at it a couple times. So what is the story of how you got on Young Indy, that sliding doors moment?
Well, I got to the point in about the late 80s, and I wasn't necessarily always pushing to be a production designer. I thought supervising art director, just seeing how good Stuart was, I thought, I don't know whether I can get there. But then Peter Young, a very successful set decorator, Batman, all sorts of things, Tim Burton movies, he suggested there was a TV series going to Hong Kong. It was a bit like Miami Vice, a UK TV series, mix of nationalities, and Peter just very kindly put my name forward, and I did that show.
Billy told me something was going down, but we weren't prepared for this. Miller wasn't stupid. He was getting greedy. Greedy people make mistakes, cut and dry. At least that's the way it's supposed to be.
And it was quite a complicated show. They had 2 units shooting at the same time, but with one production designer. That was my first job, really, as a production designer. So we did that show, and then I went. Sometimes it's hard to remember the timeline, but I think I've got this right. I then went back to do a second season of that show a year later, but after 6 weeks, it got cancelled from some political thing. So I came back, and then within 3 weeks, I was asked, or I was interviewed with Steven Soderbergh to do Kafka, his feature after Sex, Lies and Videotape.
Kafka. Is that your real name? But why shouldn't it be?
There are people watching.
This has been opened. Oh. Shall I reseal it?
I understand you fancy yourself as a writer. You should find a more athletic hobby. You don't belong here, do you?
Academy Award winner Jeremy Irons is Kafka. To solve a mystery, he will enter a nightmare. Kafka, directed by Steven Soderbergh.
And that connection had come because Baltimore Pictures, who was run by Barry Levinson and Mark Johnson, had produced Young Sherlock Holmes for George, so they knew me and Norman. Norman designed that. And Stephen apparently was looking for a designer who hadn't done very much. Why? Who knows? But that's very nice. So Norman Reynolds and Barry Levinson recommended me to Stephen.
When you're making a film, you're trying to orchestrate a happy accident and collision of so many elements.
So a little sliding doors moment there. If the show I did in Hong Kong hadn't been cancelled, I wouldn't have got that next gig, really. And even though Kafka is a sort of flawed movie, every producer and director saw it because it was Soderbergh's second movie after Sex Life. So, and it does look good. It's a good looking movie. It has a lot of things that don't quite work. So to come on to your question, so I came back from Kafka, and then I started to hear that there was a young Indiana Jones series being made. And they were looking for new, younger people. And I sort of felt, well, I'd done one feature film now and I'd done one TV series. That could be a good calling card. So I first contacted, remember it was phones and letters in those days. It was nothing more than that. But I contacted Robert Watts, who was obviously the producer of the early ones, because I thought he might be doing it. And he said, no, he wasn't doing it. They were getting a new producer and they'd let me know. And that became obviously Rick McCallum. And they were quite impressed by the fact, we didn't do it in the end, they were quite impressed by the fact that the series in Hong Kong was 2 units shooting at the same time, 2 shows, and one, economically, that sounded like a good move. But I then had to find out where Rick McCallum lived, and just before Christmas it was, and he lived in the street behind me, bizarrely.
Wow, that's funny.
Wow.
So I went round, and before Christmas I put a letter through his letterbox. Didn't hear anything for about 3 weeks, Christmas, and then he got back in touch and said, come along and meet us. And
wow,
that's great.
Wow.
We are also looking for Rick McCallum. Maybe I should check the neighborhood.
Put a letter through his letterbox.
Rick was sort of new to that level, but he had done a lot of smaller shows. But he became a huge part of my life in that sense, what they were doing. And it was that led on obviously to Radioland Murders in between, and then on to the prequels. So again, there's probably about 12 sliding doors moments in that story.
It is wild how these things all come together. Like I remember years ago hearing that before Rick McCallum was hired, Howard Kazanjian, who had produced Return of the Jedi, had been offered the chance to produce Young Indy, and he turned it down. And had he done that, had he actually accepted the job, I think a lot of the big names we currently know of, yourself included, in Hollywood, just wouldn't have found work.
Rick has sort of said, subsequently, that obviously there was always a feeling that George was looking at some point to do the prequels, and with technology, waiting for digital technology to get to a point, and if some of us came out of Young Indy, there was going to be a chance that we might move on to that. But you don't, you think about next week, really, not the next. Right. Not the next job at all. Obviously, it did work out like that. And David Tattersall, Marty Smith, the editor of Phantom Menace, a lot of the craft side did in fact move across, and we were relatively cheap. We were young and enthusiastic, which obviously appealed to Rick, I'm sure.
Well, but you guys did just great work. I think sometimes, just in general, the industry doesn't like to trust younger people with big jobs, and it doesn't trust that they can deliver, and they end up paying these huge sums of money. And at the end of the day, maybe you could have saved $100 million and made the same movie.
But because I'm a lot older now, I can't go with that argument.
You're like experience, wisdom.
You want to go down that young route, But no, I think we're always really keen in the art department. Phil Harvey, my supervising art, to get a complete cross section, because I really think that, the creatives, when you're young and in your late teens, early 20s, creatively, you have no limits. You don't know the world yet. It's a bit like music, people making music in their late teens, early 20s. They don't know the problem. They just do what they want to do. Once you start to get knowledge, everything gets a little bit more, I don't know, you get afraid of it. So I love to have that sort of spirit in the art department. And the difference is we know how to make use of it, of that creative side. Whereas the younger guys, they don't quite know what to do with that sort of talent. So I think the more times you can keep that youthfulness in whatever department you're working in is brilliant.
Well, I'd love to ask, like, if you can recall, like, do you recall, like, what that interview process was like with Rick? Like, did he come at it having a plan already in place about how the show was going to proceed, or was it still very much like, we're talking about doing this thing, are you interested in coming on board?
No, I can't. To be honest, I can't actually remember where and how the interview was. It was very casual. I know that they wanted to make. I'm remembering what I'm remembering. So anybody listening, I think this is correct. But Rick, they were always keen to make the show for the cost for an episode of MacGyver. Which at the time I think was 500,000.
Wow.
Yeah.
But that was like was that made in Canada? I think MacGyver.
It was filmed
MacGyver?
in Vancouver. Yeah.
Yeah. But very contemporary, set in one place.
Right.
So this is probably Rick's instigation. I'm sure that we want to do this really worldwide period show in many different countries for that figure. So I'm not saying that was the criteria for making the show. I mean, you can see how George, I think George has said in the past, it's one of the proudest things he's done. You may get that more than I do, and whether that's true. And, trying to bring a bit of history and a bit of knowledge without being too, ingratiating about it, but just like to try and include that in the story. I think that was his creative sort of vision. And whereas Rick's creative vision, let's do it as cheaply as we can. But that's probably pretty common on most productions, that sort of vibe. So that was our initial, and we were very new to it. Remember, all the guys and gals who were involved at that point, we're not making it up as we went along, but it was like, oh, how do we do this? How do we shoot these sort of periods? And they had the great idea of going to different countries for 3 or 4 episodes, using the local crew wherever possible, getting different directors in. They had I think it was just basically a 2-week shoot each time for each episode. So very similar to TV that even today that we all know. But I don't know whether there was any written theory about how what the idea of the show was going to be. I mean, I know George was very keen to bring the scale of film drama into the TV world, and I think probably if we look back, it was quite advanced for its time. If you look at all the TV and streaming shows now that have a very filmic quality to it, Young Indy, that was its aim right from the beginning, and I think George always wanted to have maybe 5 or 10 visual effects shots, which just gave you that extra effort to see a scale, not always playing safely. And interestingly, he didn't really mind if, I learned this later when we were on Phantom Menace and we were at ILM watching little bits put together, that he would only watch a sequence within a section or within the sequence. He wouldn't analyze, and he'd watch it 3 times, and if it was fine for him, he didn't really mind if the audience went out and analyzed every pixel and found things that were wrong. If it worked within the before and after that little piece to the audience seeing it for the first time, which is great. If somebody wants to go and analyze it, and that's good. So, if you hit a good spot 90% of the time, that was great. If you got the good spot, up to 110%, sometimes that was better. But he just wanted to get that. And obviously financially, I think again, it's hard to remember, but a lot of those digital with the Harry machines were being used on commercials for replication, very early days of all that sort of what And in fact, you probably know that Rick didn't use ILM for Young Indy. He used a commercials company in San Francisco because he just felt he could control financially maybe where that was going. I think
interesting.
This is really for other people to say, but I think Rick felt that ILM was just sort of too big to control for something like Young Indy, so he wanted to go a sort of different route. And I think the average shot on a commercial was about $25,000 for some sort of digital shot. I mean, being really vague about this, but George wanted to get it down to $2,000 or $3,000 per shot. And I say, if it didn't quite work, that was fine, because of what you imagine the TVs in those days weren't quite as crisp as they are.
Very forgiving,
now. So we usually had about 4 or 5 those sort of bigger, grander shots to put in that just gave it an extra bit of scale.
Do you recall what was kind of the first, like the early tasks that you were set to tackle? Like, we know kind of about the production schedule and such, but like in those early days, was your job kind of more episode to episode basis, or was it more like topic to topic? Like, we're tackling some Europe stuff, this week we're tackling some stuff in Asia this week.
No, it was episode to episode, and we tried to do 2 or 3 episodes. I think in the first 2 episodes, I think, were England and Egypt, I think. And we started at Shepperton, and we knew for Egypt we had to build a little bit of a pyramid, a little bit of tomb work, and then England was as location. But then we knew pretty quickly we were heading off to Prague to do 3 episodes. I can't remember which ones, Russia, France, and somewhere else. So my job was always, in a sense, going to that next spot once the first spot was done. So you were continually going backs and forwards. But first off, it would have been very similar to a normal show. Here we are, we're doing an England episode and an Egyptian episode. What are the timescales? How long do we have to build? How long do we have to design? But then you'd have to get off to Prague and start briefing the local location managers in what you're looking for. There were advantages in that sometimes, that things are getting a bit tricky. I could get on a plane and fly to another. I've got to got to go to Africa now, boys. Good luck. See you when I get back. No, we just got into a pattern, and David Barron, who was the first season's sort of UPM, unit production manager, and Rick, who went on to do the Harry Potter shows, was great. There was a great camaraderie and an excitement about the speed that we were working at. But the directors were all really interesting. I mean, without going sideways too much, I know friends I've got who were brought up at the BBC when it was more of a full-time world rather than freelance. And I was always a bit jealous of the designers who came through at a company like that, because they got to meet lots of different directors. Their shows would be different directors in-house at the BBC. So Young Indy, for me, you could imagine, like, different directors coming in for every episode, doing 2. The education side of it, of dealing with numerous personalities of all sorts, was immensely beneficial, to know how that interaction, how you deal with it. I mean, there were 2 very close together. We had Nick Rogue did an episode in Prague, and then Billy August did the episode afterwards. And Nick was a complete sort of renegade, in a sense, that it was all instinctive. I mean, we would go and look at a location like a grand house and looking for a bedroom for Mata Hari, and we would drive past the location and he'd say, "That'll do," and we said, "We haven't been inside." It's like, okay. And then we'd turn up on set to shoot it, and well, who chose this?
Oh, no, that's the worst.
Well, you did, Nick, actually. You didn't go in.
Henry, I need your help today.
How?
I have been forced to move out of my country house. Such a dreadful, depressing ordeal.
But then Billy August, in his Scandinavian side, was completely the opposite. He was, I've been lucky enough to be involved in Spielberg shows like Empire of the Sun. And, he would come on in those days, if everything was sorted this, right, the 11 o'clock with crane, track, whatever. And Billy Algus was exactly like that. You know, he would often finish by 4 o'clock.
You told her what? I told her I was going across the lines again and might get killed. It really worked. Oh, I don't believe this. What, are you crazy? But she kissed me. What a kiss. I'm practically melted. You lunatic. That's the worst thing you could have done. Why? 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 He asked me why?
Everything was laid out. So you had Nick Rogue, and you're sort of overlapping with them in my job, obviously, because some was prepping and some was shooting. But the interesting thing for me, they both were brilliant episodes. So that whole learning curve, there isn't a way.
Yeah.
There are people, and you just have to sort of, as quickly as you can, get to... The hardest thing on a feature or a longer show, for me, is not hardest thing, but that first 2 months, although people know you've got a reputation of sorts, is you have to get that trust. The director they need to gain your trust, or either way around, really. Obviously, if you work with a director a second time, that's brilliant because you've already got that trust. But you could imagine on Young Indy, we didn't have many double directors, I don't think. You were always having to deal every 2 or 3 weeks. There was a new director coming in, and you had to very quickly, because we're artists, but we're collaborative. We are myself, the DP, the editor, the costume designer, visual effect. We're all working for the director. We're all working for the story. I have to say, lots of things come to mind. The brilliant thing about Young Indy, other people may have said, was I think first season we had all the episodes virtually as we started. I mean, that was with Frank Darabont, various people involved. It was and it was only looking back, having done now other TV series where scripts don't come quite as fast as that. The more information you have early, the better you can be, more effective creatively and obviously financially. And that was something he just wanted to get all the scripts. I'm not sure whether it was the same for the second series, or I didn't do the third series, but the second series, I'm not sure whether it was, but it was always really, really well planned.
I wanted to ask a little bit about how you approached the show, and I've watched some of the documentaries from like the Phantom Menace, and a lot of set building. It's very fabricated, and this show being sort of so location based, as you mentioned, you're going around, you're finding these locations. How much of what we're seeing, in the show is, set work? Like, is it largely real locations and you're sort of tweaking as you go, or did you do?
Oh, yeah, on Young Indy, yes. Yeah, I think, I couldn't put a percentage on it, but it's interesting as a comparison. I did Silo 1, obviously, which was 99% studio based. We had half a day on location.
We do not know why we are here. We do not know who built the silo and why we are underground. We only know the world outside our sanctuary is death.
If you boil the pact down to one rule, it's do not say you want to go outside.
Everything, moving sets. Whereas we're on Amazon Citadel season 2 now, which Joe Russo is directing all the episodes, which is quite exciting for that.
Can I trust you?
Of course. Can I trust you?
Always.
But this is 90% location. So I've switched, okay, that's interesting. Now we're going back to that. So what I'm doing now, probably, although we're only early days, is what we did on Young Indy. You basically, anything you can find on location, that is the aim. But obviously in Egypt, for instance, we were down in a tomb. That was going to be built set, that. So, and the same with us. I don't know. Citadel is a Mission Impossible type show. People get blown up and killed a lot. That you can't do that in a lot of locations. So there are certain times you have to build something just purely for the action. But you're right. The aim was to find as much as we could. And I'm just trying to, like, for instance, in the First World War one with Rennie Manzo, we had the trenches, classic trenches. So we did, we built the trenches on the back lot and barroned off, and the living huts underneath that. You weren't going to find those, but there were obviously great value in buildings and architecture certainly, going to Prague in the early 90s, just after I'd been there on Kafka. Kafka was in Prague, and that was just after the Velvet Revolution. So it was still very much in that sort of socialist feel. Prague is a completely different city now. Buildings are still there, but it's not what it was then. So we were lucky that we could make use of, we made it for probably 5 or 6 different European countries in Prague itself. So you're going there for the locations, and I presume from Rick's point of view, it could be cheaper. Yeah. There's financial advantages to traveling to certain countries.
I'm glad you mentioned that episode with the trenches, because there's a wonderful one-er shot in there where Indy's walking through the trenches, and the camera's sort of tracking with him, and he actually goes down into the hut, right into where the commander is. And it's possible that there's a cut in there, but I was wondering, is the hut built under the trenches, or is that on a soundstage? Funny how you remember these things. All the crew complained. Why didn't we build this bit on the stage? Because I can't. Well, René didn't want to. I think it was René that he wanted to take that and you didn't. And also feel it, you know what I mean? I know it sounds funny, but feel the smell of the earth and the reality. So, it could have been done both ways, and it would have, but no, it was built actually as a real thing on the location. Wow.
We were on the back lot, so we were controlled.
Yeah.
But we didn't cut at the doorway and go to a stage set.
That's great.
Still not really sure why. Probably be more sensible in the stage.
I think it does add to the level of realism to it. It's a wonderful shot there, and that brings up the next question though, which would be like, you mentioned a lot of the stuff you're able to use existing locations, but when it comes to the World War I material and like the battles and the no man's land and things like that, like what was your process like for designing and
I think thinking of a show here they did recently, Warhorse with Spielberg, and also 1917. You're basically looking for empty, controllable landscapes where you can build, do whatever you want. And the difference these days is that we had to really worry about what you could see in the distance, whereas these days, if it's dramatically wrong, they can, not easily, because it's always expensive removing stuff, but we didn't have that luxury,
right.
particularly. So but then we were in a place, Prague, Czech Republic, at that time where there wasn't a lot of wrong stuff there to see, if you see what I mean. So I think we did do a lot of it on the back lot. It was a very big back lot at Barrandov with the trenches. It's funny. I think if you bought up a seat and showed me, I'd probably remember. So I know. But I say without seeing it again, it's hard to know which bits. But I know of Verdun, we did an awful lot of work out on the landscape with René. And it looks like France, it feels like that, and the buildings, the old farm, they're all real. In those days, they hadn't been renovated and made into anything. They almost looked bomb damaged to start with. And I remember now, there was another town in the north of the Czech Republic, which really looked like it hadn't been touched for like 50, 60 years. I'm sure it's now gentrified and looks lovely as a tourist, but we had those advantages that we could find places that still felt like you were in the middle of a war, because the Cold War hadn't, that had been going on for quite a long time, and there wasn't a lot of investment behind the Iron Curtain, certainly on the western side of the Iron Curtain, the western end of it, away from Russia. There wasn't a lot of investment there.
The impression I get from hearing all these stories is, this was really a very sort of what you might call like an independent film crew. You're going into these locations and sort of taking advantage of what's there. And it's opportunistic shooting in a way, because you don't know, if you're prepping episode to episode, you don't know that you're going to find that great house next week. You're hoping to.
Yeah, I think it's two things to that. I think we were very organized, and Rick would often say we were a bit like a guerrilla unit going out and doing. But we did, everything was very well planned, not just from our side. It was treated, because even then, 500,000 doesn't sound, but it was actually quite a lot of money back then. In some senses, even though it was only a cost of MacGyver. But I think the problem with it on MacGyver was a lot of the money wasn't being shown on screen. And I think the main thing was that they wanted to get the emphasis of the money we did have to be seen, rather than, doesn't really help if it's not seen on that basis. But I think it was, we were acting pretty, locations. You would never go and shoot without permission somewhere, I don't think. Has anybody talked to you about Turkey?
No. What happened in Turkey?
That's another whole episode. We always thought
that's why we're here. What happened in the country, the great nation of Turkey?
Well, we always thought George and Rick should write a book on Turkey. Dead donkeys in the hotel. The donkey man got very upset and left a couple of dead donkeys in the hotel foyer at one point. Oh my God. Not because of any bad treatment. We also we shot Beersheba in Turkey, and we needed a sand dune basically to build Beersheba or the town, and the only one sand dune in Turkey seemed to be about 80 miles north of Izmir, I think. And so we went there, and it's like one. You couldn't really shoot off it, so we built Beersheba. In the morning we went to shoot, had snowed for the first time in 60 years. So we swept it. If you look at that episode, you'll see snow on the sand dune. You don't realize it's snow, but it is actually snow.
Wow.
And at Beersheba, there's a lot of horse work in it. Simon Windsor was the director, Australian director of that episode, I think, and he had done The Light Horseman, I think. And all the Turkish guys said, very nice people. Loads of horses here, but they're sort of miniature horses in Turkey. They're not really the same size as our ones.
Interesting.
And I know that there was they had a lot of trouble with the production company out there who were don't want to get into trouble. People were faking receipts, they refused. I know they refused the final footage to leave the country. So Charles Salmon, who was the assistant unit production, he was the producer in Turkey. He had to go back and pretend to shoot a documentary, not on Young Indy, on something else, and then swapped that physical footage with the footage from Young Indy.
This they don't teach in school. This is a real stuff.
On that way.
Wow.
It was, but it was in a silly way. I mean, it sounds odd and they're pretty interesting life experiences.
Yeah.
I mean, all the people we dealt with, the art department, it was brilliant. It was all that. It was just at the top end. And we always felt it was a bit odd. And Callum McDougall was the UK production manager who's now doing the Bond movies and things, still good friends with Callum. He said it was really silly what they were doing because Turkey could have really opened up as a film hub. That's what they were hoping. But you don't start off by trying to steal the money. Don't put this out anywhere. Being rather deceitful with things, it's like a bit short-sighted. Well, if you're going to do that, do it later on when all the big films are out here, not young. But again, the two Turkey episodes are great episodes.
Yeah, they're fantastic.
But I think there was another. I think Ricky Ayres, one of my art directors, did the third season, and I think they had an episode. I can't even remember if it's my episode or not, but they had to do some pickups with a camel. And
interesting.
That would be the Beersheba episode. Actually, they added. I believe anyway. Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong.
That's right. Yeah, you're right. It's Beersheba, and that had Hugh. Didn't that have? Was that Hugh Grant's old lady girl?
It was Catherine Zeta-Jones is in that, and
yeah, sounds right. Yeah, sorry, that's right. Yes, yeah. So we missed out on the camel in Turkey. So we had to try and David Brown was the production manager. So when we got back to Prague, he had to try and find a camel, and the only camel that they had in the Prague Zoo was a miniature camel, right? So when he bought it out to show Sean Patrick Flannery, he was sort of taller than the camel. And then they shot. I think Ricky was he was the art director with me in Prague on that one. So and I'd left to go to another country. So they had to, I think they went to a quarry. They went to a sand quarry in Prague with the miniature camel to shoot the pickup.
Well, now I'm going to go through and I'm going to look at the shots and see, can I, yeah.
And I think, and the other thing, it was purple.
It was a purple
camel. Was purple.
Wow.
Wow.
And I don't think
that's a beautiful camel. You'd love to see that.
I don't think these a long time ago, these aren't anecdotes that have been elaborated. This is what the basic story was back at the time, so
there's no exaggeration because it hasn't been told 100 times. Yeah.
How can you quantify that as a life experience?
It sounds wild.
It's great, isn't it? I mean, the film business, this very generalization, you'll probably agree with it. In those days, even the 90s, it wasn't as bureaucratic and as health and safety conscious which is wrong, but it was a lot more you could do without getting, especially when you were traveling in Africa and different places.
Indy, make some room on board.
Was? Was hast du gesagt?
Ralph!
You two! Look out! Was ist los?
You want another one?
Sure, please.
Yeah. So we were in the First World War in Africa, and we had to train with a giant gun on it, and that was on a branch line outside of Mombasa. So we brought the train out of the junction. We built the Big Bertha gun on the train, but each night it had to go back to Mombasa, and so it would go back at night. So the turret, the barrel, as much as it could be lowered, it couldn't be lowered enough to clear the electric cables that were going across the railway line. So when it went back to Mombasa, we all had to sit on top of the carriages. And as we came to an electric cable, we had to sort of help. It wasn't a live cable, it was an insulated cable. We had to help it up over the barrel. And on one occasion, so they're interested. I remember sitting on top of this train looking out at the African landscape going, interesting job this, on that. And then we missed, and then one night, I don't think I was on the train at the bit where they were doing that. I was down the other end just keeping track of things. But it clipped a wire and a whole village went out. On the side. So that was Peter McDonald. I think, Peter Mack directing that episode.
Wow.
Yeah, that was a good episode. So, and that, you another
Please.
one? Yeah. You might have to get me back again on this.
Yeah, we think we're gonna.
So we were up the Tana River in Kenya, doing, I can't remember what, probably a bit of the African episode. Oh, we had the boat on the river. But we were right up in the hillsides in a campsite up there for a different part, not the river bit, another part. And Simon was very sweet, Simon Windsor, the director, but he was a bit of a taskmaster, shall we say. So and every morning he used to go out for a run around the campsite and sort of come back again. So Gary Crosby, our head scenic painter, was always a bit of a humorous fellow. He brought out a tape recording credit of lions roaring, and he took his boombox out into the landscape in the morning, and set it off when Simon was running around, and we were just waiting at breakfast, waiting back, and he came back. Simon came back as fast and as red as you could think of. No, and he never went for another run.
Nobody told him. It's just a recording.
I don't know whether he ever. I don't know whether he ever knew. I can't remember whether we. Whether he ever knew that was. But look, when you're away like that, those things happen. That you've got to amuse yourself. And they were harmless. They weren't. He didn't set off a real lion.
He just made his heart beat faster. That's all.
That would have been a harder one. Yeah.
Wow.
Anyway,
it's always wild to me. Like I feel like for myself, and I think for Daniel too, it's like the stories we hear about Young Indy are kind of the reason we got into this industry. It just sounds like such an exciting life. And yeah, as you said, it's like now it's become so bureaucratic. And so,
Yeah, we still have fun. Everybody has fun on what they do and everything, but it was just a bit anarchic in that. It didn't seem it. It just seemed like that was the normal.
Yeah.
That's what it was. But obviously these days, it's a much more corporate really as well. Even at the end of the 90s, the film business hadn't become so business orientated. Right. But it's interesting. You said independent, like an independent film earlier on. I think George has always said he makes independent films, hasn't he? I mean, since he left Hollywood, that's what he thinks he's doing. Whether it's Star Wars or whatever, he wanted control and being independent. Obviously they're big budgets, but in theory, I mean, maybe not completely, but he made the films he wanted to make. Without too much. Whether people like them or don't like them, that, if you're in George's position, that's fine. This is what I want to make. And if you don't like it, you can go make something else yourself, and that's fine too.
Yeah.
Obi-Wan!
Hello, Dex.
Take a seat. I'll be right with you.
But he always was an independent. I mean, when we were at the ranch, in prepping those things, the whole area at the back of the ranch was all meant to be sort of postgraduate film students, all the cottages at the back. I don't think it ever really quite evolved into that sort of world so much, but he was always keen on young filmmakers, because that's where he came from in a sense, wasn't it? He got some very interesting breaks as well through that sort of help. I remember one time I was on Return to Oz.
Mm-hmm. I haven't done anything to you.
Isn't that a stolen lunch pail in your hand? Isn't that a chicken in there with you? Chicken! The Gnome King doesn't allow chickens anywhere in the house.
Who's the Gnome King?
Who's the Gnome King?
With Walter Murch was directing, and Norman Reynolds designing again. And it wasn't going too well in the first 2 or 3 weeks, just because Walter, such a lovely guy, Walter. He hadn't really directed before. And I remember on one morning, and I'm sure I had a Polaroid of this, but I lost it. On set was Coppola, Lucas, and Spielberg, and they were all helping their pal to direct. I don't mean but they were there to support him, and I can see them now standing in this alcove on one side of the set. And I'm sure I've got a Polaroid somewhere in a box somewhere, and you think, wow, that's a quiz question somewhere. I mean, Coppola was really the teacher of all of them in a sense, wasn't he? He was the one that was sort of like not the father figure on that way, but they were all very supportive, that sort of group at the time.
Well, I was very lonely and discouraged during my film student years because I felt that the theater students really work together, and there are actors, and you're always excited because in a few weeks you're going to put the show on. And I found the film students in those days were very isolated, one from the other. They were always talking in very intellectual terms, and they were more like critics than filmmakers, I thought. It's George's idea to do a movie set in Vietnam because the word was coming back. Vietnam was like a war, unlike any war that had come before. And the stories from the soldiers who came back was extraordinary. And so George got a friend, John Milius, who had a lot of buddies who were in the war, and together they cooked up the project. And it was one of the projects that our new independent company, Zortrup, was going to do, and George was going to direct it. 16 millimeter he was going to do, and he was going to make it sort of like a combat film.
That's just what you love to see, and it's that collaborative spirit that they had. I think that group of friends had and still have largely, but it's, it's what we all kind of hope, the Hollywood world it could be like. And I think largely it is, but it's just wonderful to see that even when they hit that level of success where they didn't need to be there. In most corporate Hollywood just would have ridden the movie off. And yet, as I understand it, Lucas really put his investment, a lot of himself on the line to make sure that movie got finished. And that was very cool.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to say it, but I don't, they, like a lot of people successful, they don't necessarily aim to do it for the money. It's often by default that you arrive in that position. I'm sure it's very nice that he has the money, but it's sort of, I think it's even in his Skywalking book, isn't it, that I think that time when they made so much money probably out of Star Wars 1 and they didn't know, he asked financiers, what do I do with it? And they said, put it in gold. And then there was a financial crisis. And I'd say this is in the books here, so it's not me saying this, and then the price of gold went up like tenfold, basically, and that's what bought the ranch. That's what paid for the ranch to be built. Wow. But that wasn't through any, planning. It was just the financiers said that for the moment the safest place to put the money is in gold, because that's pretty stable. But they didn't have a clue that there was going to be a financial crisis around the end of the 70s. On that basis, I mean, you might want to check that in the book before you let that out. But I think that's pretty much what happened.
I think it's very fair to say, like, he managed to both get lucky, but he also prepped to get lucky. It's like he was smart, and with his investments, he made plans, hoping they would succeed, and luckily. They did in some big ways. Obviously, he also had some failures. A well-timed divorce did not exactly help his finances all that much. But but luckily though, he was able to really finance some wonderful projects.
But he didn't. When we were down in Sydney, prepping clones. I know Rick. They were trying to find some really stunning, picturesque. With a boat, houses on the shorefront for George, and he ended up choosing a semi-detached, a minute's walk from the studio. It's not about that. Hard to say that when you see the ranch and his house, but that wasn't his. That's not what he was.
He's very practical. He's a very practical person, I think, and that's.
Yeah, and I think this one might be a fable, but I think it's right because the paparazzi were trying to chase George all over the place but they could never find him in Sydney because he didn't ever go anywhere really. And the only place I think they got a clip of him was in the equivalent of Walmart, and he was buying this. You better check this, but he was buying episodes of Young Indy.
That's great.
Because he wanted to show his kids, but they didn't have the right format.
Of course.
So he needed the Australian format to show, and I think it was Jet and one of the others, I think. So I'm pretty sure that could be an anecdote that's gone one too far, but I sort of do remember it from being in Australia that the one picture they had of George in the papers was at the equivalent of a Walmart.
That's awesome.
So
we'll find it. If it's in the tabloids from the 2000s, we will find it. I wanted to ask maybe a sort of a final anecdote. You mentioned that you didn't do the third season of Young Indy. What was that transition like for you from Young Indy into the Phantom Menace, into the Star Wars prequel?
Well, the intermediate bit was Radioland Murders,
of course.
So they knew they were going to do Radioland Murders. So. And at that point, we knew that Phantom Menace was on the cards. I remember I was driving around Prague in the second season with George, with Rick and with David Tattersall, just in the back of a minibus, and Rick just looking over and saying, "How'd you like to do a Star Wars film?" Oh, okay, that's sort of how it was, but George wanted to try some of the digital technology that he'd used in Young Indy to the next level. Not only that, but on Radioland Murders, which was something he'd had written a long time ago. It was one of his little pet projects. So then that's when Ricky, my supervising art director on season 1 and 2, took over season 3. And we went off to North Carolina to do Radioland Murders.
I don't have time to mince words, Claudette. I want my marriage back, and you're going to get it from me tonight when you tell Penny what really happened.
Scram, Scribbler, you're boring me.
There was just sort of some technology in that. We did actually do a couple of shots where we had George was always quite keen, despite his digital to do some old-fashioned things. So we did do a couple of foreground miniatures of ceilings and things in there, which were really nice to do. But the digital world has sort of taken over that a little bit now, going back to the old physical ways of doing things. But there's certainly a lot of digital. They were trying to get the cost of the digital shots down even more. I'm not saying that's the reason they did Radioland Murders, and there are little bits of Radioland Murders which is very funny, but it didn't quite work as a movie altogether.
I don't know what you know that I know, but I do know that you don't know what you think you know. Oh, no!
Maybe it was a little bit better than Howard the Duck, I don't know, but Howard the Duck has its followers, doesn't it?
He's 27 years old, single but searching. Favorite sports, windsurfing and Aikido. Favorite pastimes, cigars and sex.
I love them both. Gavin. I don't know what you're talking about. Those movies are great.
And we were right under we were under union situations there. So turnaround times, we would always end up on a Friday shooting the acts that were on the stage in the radio hall. And in the end, we were shooting on Friday. We'd always end up, the call time would be midnight because everything got pushed back during the week. So we would just have the whole of the Saturday morning as our shoot day. And each one became a party because there was music playing, there were people performers, they were being filmed. But you can imagine by the time at the end of 3 o'clock on a Saturday morning. So that was a pretty. There's a lot of stories in North Carolina is quite a funny place sometimes at night. I don't know whether it still has that reputation.
I've never heard this. This is interesting. I don't spend much time there.
No, one of our ADs went off driving one evening just to see something, and came back with bullet holes in the back of his car.
Wow, that's rough.
So we're not quite sure where he'd gone and why, but no names mentioned in that one. But Radioland Murders was a fun show to do, but by then we knew we were doing Phantom Menace, and then the whole thing was starting to gear up. But we were still pretty naive at what we were doing. And Peter Russell was my supervising art director on that show and the set. Well, all three of them, actually. And I remember when we finished Phantom Menace at Leavesden, when we finished and we left, and we did say to ourselves, well, at least we got something on our tombstone that somebody will recognise. Sort of for good or bad. And I think we're all really, we knew probably we were going to get, not us particularly, because we couldn't use hardly anything that was in the main, because we were prequels, apart from R2-D2 and C-3PO, Millennium Falcon and all, we couldn't rely on any of that. I mean, obviously we had Mos Espa instead of Mos Eisley. We had that Tatooine connection. But we always felt like when the sequels came out, they had all that memory and actors to bring back in. So we always felt a bit naked at the beginning. But not for us to say, but I don't think we were ever, not criticised for the way the show looked. There got criticisms for George and the storytelling and whatever. I mean, I think originally George wasn't going to do the clones and Sith, but I think why shouldn't he? It's my show. I'll do it. On that basis. I think there was some talk at one point about because they're in Australia about Baz Luhrmann doing one of the episodes, one of the shows.
Oh wow!
That would have been interesting.
It'd be a musical, perhaps, or it's a different. No, the movies are beautiful, and the design work. I think now, 30 years later, it stands out as being so unique. And there's a shot I saw on Twitter yesterday of just this. It's a visual effects shot, but it's like a pan up of the Senate building, and there's all these people out there, and it's sort of a massive plaza, and they're like, name a movie that has this.
And compared to what we said before, the whole introduction of concept artists, and obviously I was with Doug Chang on that first one, and he came through from that sort of level, and they had a group of 3 or 4, Eric Tiemans and 3, and everybody just threw their ideas in together. And in a sense, obviously, I was out often looking for locations, whether it was in Italy or Tunisia, those side, but then giving that information back, they would work on that. So that whole collaboration, I mean, because everybody wants everything so quickly these days, you need that group of people. Everybody expects everything tomorrow, not in 3 weeks' time. That's the problem with the digital world. In some senses, the producers think they can have everything tomorrow, but you can't just turn on a tap with this stuff and be instantly brilliant with it.
That's true. I mean, what I love about the prequels is you can just freeze frame any moment in those films, and you can just like dissect all the creativity going on in that single frame, and it's just so diverse, it's so different, so unique. And so often now, you pop in a sci-fi or whatever franchise movie out there, and it just all looks the same. It's just like one, it's just aliens are now just like blobby things that just like waddle around or whatever, and it's just like this is.
I think there's also this is my effect. There's almost too much of too much coming out. Yeah, when Lord of the Rings came out, Star Wars came. It was always an event every couple of years. It was always like a big thing. You can always get a bit almost over. Which one is it? Is that from this one or is that from that one? But that's all part of their business, isn't it? Keeping all those things sort of moving as fast as they want.
Well, and you mentioned too how George was initially looking for someone else to direct him, and I think it speaks to how different of a time it was. Like I know a lot of the people he asked. Doing sci-fi franchise things just wasn't seen as this prestige thing as it is today. And well, I'm sure George partly was. Maybe it didn't take much to get him to direct it, but I imagine if it was done today, like he probably could have found somebody, because the late '90s was just a very.
I think most people agree that Empire is probably the top of the list. Directed. Richard did the third one again. You just get that extra creativity, don't you? There's always a slight issue going back to that music analogy. When the Beatles split up, they all did great stuff, but they never did quite as great stuff when they were all arguing with each other about what to do. That creative bond. And when I was young, growing up, I worked on Eric the Viking with Tim Robbins, which is a Terry Jones Monty Python movie. Sure. There's a whole lot of stories in there.
Well, I just think it's a little bit crude, that's all.
But basically, Terry wrote it, produced it, directed it, and starred in it. So he's a lovely, lovely man. But you sort of think, you need people arguing with you, creatively questioning things, not just going on one line. But once you've been successful, everybody would have the feeling, I can do it myself. But none of the Pythons individually are as good as the Pythons together.
Sure, sure.
As it is. But anyway. I don't know how much we talked about Young Indy compared to other things.
That's all right. That's all right. Hopefully we can have you back on the show sometime.
Anytime. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff because it's it is ingrained in here somewhere, and it sometimes takes a question to bring it out.
That'd be great. Yeah.
So we'll bring pictures next time. We have some footage of you from a Laserdisc in Japan going over storyboards or concept drawings for the train, like you're mentioning the tracks and the build out. So
what are we on? Which program are we on?
It's the Phantom Train of Doom ride, and I believe the footage is
it's a behind the scenes. It's called Young Indy Around the World, and it's like interviews. Sean Flannery's in there. Talking about the show, probably put together in like 1993, I think, based on when the...
if you've got a link to that anywhere, can you send it?
By the time the director joins, we've probably got models and drawings and many location photographs. What you do find that most directors react much better to models, be they block models or little simple card models. They can actually get in there and you can see their mind actually starting to be inside that rather than just like looking at a picture.
Now, that reminds me when we were doing, if you got one more, when we were on clones in Australia. So our link, we were always, well, not Zooming, but obviously the equivalent. So we used to have a video link, obviously. And for sets, we would sort of conceive a set size physically as a model, and we would have 3 versions of it laid up for George to look at on the video. So and one was small, one was medium, one was big, depending on how much visual effects, how much control, what you do want to be in camera most of the time. And we used to have the Price is Right stickers on each of the models. And then we used to peel off the prices.
So you show them, you're like, okay, this is what it looks like, and this is your feelings. Now here's what it costs.
And I think you'd always would choose the cheapest one.
Yeah, they're already building sets. God help me. I'm going to have to start this script pretty soon.
It wasn't the quality of it was how much of there was.
We analyzed where the actors came in most contact with the set itself, where they needed to be a part of the set, and where they didn't.
You know, it wasn't like the quality. So I think that George, on a very personal level, that sort of sense of really silly humour is that's sort of him inside. And I think, well, you've only got to look at Jar Jar and that whole world of that. That's where he comes from a lot of the time. You know. Yeah. You know, on that basis. So
that's great.
Well, we're going to get you back on the show soon if we can, because this has been a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, no, anytime.
I think we could easily go on for many, many more episodes here.
Well, do check anything I've said if possible. I think everything I've said is, as far as I know, is not exaggerated in any sense particularly.
We'll make sure that nothing is put out there that's libelous.
Okay. No, but it's great fun. I'd say just get back in touch. We're always happy to do it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And for you, it sounds like you got Citadel Season 2 happening right now, which is a big project.
Yeah, no, we're lucky. You know, it's still quite quiet over here. Probably a bit the same over there. You know, I think the producer, Chris Castaldi of Citadel, who I've known before, he said he thinks the streaming services are going to start again September. They've got, funnily enough, from COVID, they've got enough stock. You know, they've almost got enough things to release, but it's hard. You know, I'm used to it. I've been 35 years of up and down, you know, working, not working, getting used to it. But there's a whole group over here. It's been so busy, 10, 15 years into the business, where they think that it's forever.
Yeah.
That you know, and then COVID hits. Oh God, portcullis comes down, and then the strike. And in a very harsh way, it's good that they know that it's a freelance business, and you can't, however busy it is one year, if exchange rates change or the world goes odd, anything can happen. So we just keep saying, just make sure you save a bit of money. Yes. You know, just for those. I mean, I don't know about you, but there aren't many jobs that are full-time these days and secure. You know, unless you work for the government or bank, you know, that's what I don't even know if that's there. So, no, it's Citadel's great. We didn't, I wouldn't normally do a second series of something, but Joe Russo being involved in and directing, that's pretty good to be in his world. And he seems incredibly nice. And he wants to do it. It's like an Avengers thing. There's a Citadel Italy and a Citadel India.
Yeah.
So they're trying to do this sort of characters crossing over from one to another in that way. And people often ask me, what do you want to do next? And the next one is always, you want to be different from the one before. And if you're going from Silo, which is purely set building, to a show that's all location, then that's interesting change. So it's Young Indy mode. We're in Young Indy mode.
Young Indy mode
for the next 9 months. Young Indy location mode.
That's great.
But I'm sure we'll have to be a bit more corporate and sensible on this one.
For sure. Awesome. Well,
anyway,
Gavin, thank you so much for being on the show.
Nice to meet everybody.
Listeners out there, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can find us at Young Indy Pod on Instagram. Please rate us 5 stars. It helps other people find our podcast and makes us feel good.
Like and subscribe.
Until next time, keep on adventuring.
Next time on the Young Indy Chroniclers.
We're thrilled to have